August 27th, 2018. It's a hot summer day in Missouri City, Texas, a sprawling suburban town of 70,000, a half-hour southwest of Houston.
We have a lot of people that are moving here. They want the big city feel, but with a small town atmosphere.
It's a friendly town. A lot of good people work and live here.
There's so much room for opportunity and growth.
But sometimes, in the middle of all that growth, the wrong opportunity can arise. Around 7 o'clock that evening, Missouri City 911 receives a panicked call from a mother desperate to find her daughter.
A woman calls because her daughter hasn't returned home like she was supposed to.
The missing girl is 19-year-old Sabrina Herrera.
She had had lunch with her mother earlier that day.
And what made you think she was missing?
She was supposed to pick up my son from the bus stop, and she never got there.
The brother called their mother, and the mother then started to make phone calls.
She called her daughter repeatedly, but Sabrina never answered, nor did she call her back.
That's not like her.
She was very organized, very mindful, and so for her to not pick up her little brother from school, that's highly unusual.
She lived for work.
Sabrina!
When Sabrina's mother came home,
Sabrina!
she went to Sabrina's room and saw that her work uniform was still on her bed.
Sabrina's mom is frantic.
She had no idea where her daughter was.
But she did have a way to find out.
Because they both had iPhones, they would share each other's location.
Her mom was able to use a GPS tracking device on her phone to pinpoint where her daughter was located.
Or so she'd thought.
I can't find her, but I found her car and all her belongings.
Her purse was still there, her phone was there.
The car keys are in there?
Yes.
I can imagine that fear just increasing, what's happening, what's happened to Sabrina.
Barely out of high school, Sabrina Herrera had big plans for her future.
At that young age, you're about to break out into the world.
She was getting ready to leave a world that was very comfortable and go into a world of the unknown, but she was ready to embrace it.
She'd already proven that she was up to the challenge.
At the beginning of her junior year, she had transferred to a new high school.
As you can imagine, being a teenager transferring to a new school, that's tough.
But not for Sabrina.
Hey, good morning. Hey, see you later. Everyone who met Sabrina instantly fell in love with her.
She actually flourished, and she made the most of her experience.
She was on the high school dance team. She was captain of the cheerleading team. Hey.
She also found a new boyfriend.
It started out just as teenage puppy love.
A year older than Sabrina, Troy Parker was already a big man on campus.
Troy was an outstanding athlete. He was very good in what he did on the football field.
He had some aspirations to become a professional football player.
It seemed like fate that they would end up together.
It's a classic high school love story. Sabrina was the high school cheerleader, and Troy was the captain of the football team.
They were like a star couple. Two popular kids in school, just feeling like they had it all.
The couple stayed together even after Troy graduated.
What started as a high school romance blossomed, and this relationship that she had with Troy was her first real, mature, adult-type relationship.
Once she graduated, Sabrina started taking classes at a Houston community college.
She was thinking about being a nurse.
She wanted to help people. She wanted to serve. That speaks volumes to her character.
She also took a job at a local grocery store.
She's working a full-time job. She's getting a regular paycheck. She's got courses where she sets her own schedule. She can pretty much do what she wants to do at this time in her life.
And what she wanted most of all was Troy.
It was hard for her to see herself without him in her life because this was starting to be that type of relationship where you start making plans for a family and a future.
After I get my nursing degree, we should definitely talk about having kids.
Really?
Yeah.
While Troy's plan of playing pro ball didn't pan out, he encouraged Sabrina to pursue her dreams.
This is going to be a fairy tale union, and they were going to grow up and have a family and have that storybook marriage.
Sabrina was over the moon.
But now, just 1 month into her freshman year of college, the teen has gone missing, and her mother has found Sabrina's car abandoned.
It was parked at a dead end in a quiet street in a neighborhood approximately 2 miles from her home.
Her phone is here, her wallet, and her keys.
And there's no sign of her daughter.
She knew that something was wrong.
When police arrive a few minutes later, they find everything as Sabrina's mom reported.
The keys to the car were still there. Her wallet was there, her phone.
They ultimately decide this couldn't be a robbery. There's something else going on.
But this isn't a missing persons case either.
I didn't check the trunk.
At a suggestion of the mother, the officer pops the trunk. It does not open all the way at first, so he has to go back and actually lift it up.
Oh my God, Sabrina!
Within that trunk laid Sabrina Herrera.
That's my baby, Sabrina!
19-year-old Sabrina Herrera was making a great start in life.
She had a lot going for herself.
She's got a great job. She's going to good school.
She was also in a long-term relationship with her high school boyfriend, Troy Parker.
They've been talking about saving up for a house and starting a family.
They were a happy couple, a football player and a cheerleader. It's one of those things that should have turned out to be a fairy tale with a happy ending.
Instead, Sabrina's story has ended in a nightmare.
Oh my God, Sabrina!
Police have found Sabrina inside the trunk of her car.
She's not breathing. She is deceased.
At this point, it's no longer a missing persons report. Now we know it's a homicide.
That's my baby, Sabrina!
And her mother knows too.
The grief and anguish at that moment is unbelievable.
Her mother may have to relive that over and over because those images may never leave.
While patrol officers wait for homicide detectives to arrive, they face the difficult task of keeping Sabrina's mother away from her daughter.
She's frantic, and she's trying to get to Sabrina.
Sabrina!
It's very important that police keep everyone away because the police need to preserve any evidence that's left.
Her mom was put in a patrol car and taken down to the station to wait and give a formal statement to the police.
When homicide detectives arrive on the scene, they begin by examining Sabrina's body.
It was determined that her cause of death was a result of strangulation.
They saw the markings on her neck.
The evidence also suggests she was knocked down and then attacked from behind.
The detectives found a shoe print on the back of Sabrina's shirt.
The attacker had stepped on her back for leverage when he strangled her.
Although prior to being overpowered, it appears that Sabrina had done her best to fight back.
Sabrina had defensive marks on her right hand and her eye was bruised.
Those marks were a clear indication that she was fighting for her life.
Detectives are also able to determine an approximate time of death.
Sabrina had been killed at least a few hours before her body was found.
But that's about all that detectives are immediately able to determine from the crime scene.
There was no other evidence associated with who could have caused this murder.
although the scene does tell detectives a few other things about the crime.
There were these items, they were still in the car, the purse and some other valuables. That indicated that this was not a robbery.
This was a direct attack against Sabrina.
Looking for more information, detectives begin knocking on doors in the area where the killer abandoned Sabrina's car.
One of the big tools for investigations is canvassing the area where the crime occurred to see if neighbors or if businesses have cameras.
Yeah, I think my camera looks right at that spot.
They did have video footage showing where Sabrina's car was parked at that dead end.
The video shows the car pulling to a stop exactly where it's found by police, and a black male exiting the vehicle.
He parked the car at around 20 minutes after 3 and simply abandoned the vehicle.
It appears in the video that this male is holding a black bag as he's walking away.
He exited the frame in a hurry, heading toward a walking trail that led into the woods.
Unfortunately, the video quality is so low that the police are unable to obtain an accurate identity of this person.
The only thing that they had at that point was it was a black male.
Thank you. Could you email that to us?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for your cooperation.
Detectives turn next to Sabrina's mother back at the precinct.
The investigators had showed the video to Sabrina's mom to see if she could recognize the man who got out of the car.
The video is so far away that not even Sabrina's mother can identify who this person is.
I'm sorry.
While Sabrina's mom doesn't recognize the man in the video, detectives hope she can provide some clues.
The next step for police was to find out who was in Sabrina's circle. Was there anybody that they felt had a vendetta against Sabrina?
Everybody loved her.
She was a very giving young lady, very bright. She didn't have any enemies.
What about boyfriends? Was she seeing anyone?
Well, not anymore.
Sabrina's mom told police that Sabrina had broken up with Troy, her long-term boyfriend, a few weeks earlier.
The recent breakup raises an immediate red flag for detectives.
Was there trouble?
No, it wasn't like that.
It was their understanding. It had been mutual.
She felt that Sabrina and Troy were okay with that breakup, that they were going to mutually go their separate ways.
Plus, Sabrina's mom says that her daughter had recently told her about someone new.
His name was Brandon, and Sabrina met him online.
They were starting to get to know each other.
According to her mom, Sabrina and Brandon had been making plans to meet in person.
Well, did you know when they were supposed to meet?
No. All she ever told me was he seemed like a nice guy.
But could he also be a killer?
He had a great profile, but you never know what lies underneath.
Detectives investigating Sabrina Herrera's murder have just learned that the 19-year-old recently met a man online.
All she ever told me was he seemed like a nice guy.
Some of the dangers surrounding meeting people online is that you never really know who's on the other side of the computer.
You're not always guaranteed to be talking to who you think you're talking to.
The 19-year-old girl, especially as beautiful as she would have been the perfect target for a predator online.
Did Sabrina ever show you any pictures of this guy?
No.
Sabrina's mom was not able to provide any more information to police officers other than the fact that this man's first name supposedly is Brandon.
We ultimately don't know who he is. There could be some deception.
Hoping to learn more about the mysterious Brandon, detectives turn to Sabrina's social media activity. Before she left, Sabrina's mom was able to provide them with the passwords to access her daughter's accounts.
Sabrina's mom was eager to do everything possible to help the investigation and learn who killed Sabrina.
Once they're able to see her messages, detectives quickly identify their suspect.
They find that she had been communicating with a man named Brandon Fuller.
Brandon was older. He's a 26-year-old man.
Maybe that's why Sabrina didn't share too many details about him with her mother.
But it's other details in Sabrina and Brandon's online chatting that catch the detectives' attention.
According to the messages between the two, on the day that Sabrina disappeared, she was finally supposed to meet him in person.
She's supposed to meet Brandon that day, and then Sabrina shows up missing and then dead.
Could it simply be a coincidence? Or could Brandon be their killer?
They wanted to know more about him, and they start looking into who Brandon was and his social media.
Almost immediately, his profile picture seems vaguely familiar.
His physique is similar to that of the individual in the surveillance camera found dropping off Sabrina's car.
Digging deeper only increases their suspicion.
There was gang-affiliated type posts, a lot of posts that just gave them cause for concern.
It's not entirely an act either.
When the police pull Brandon's background check, they find that he has been arrested on several occasions.
It's definitely a cause for concern.
Finding an address for Brandon in his criminal record, detectives set out to conduct an interview.
When the police arrive at this location, there's a woman living there who says that she doesn't know who Brandon is.
Who? I don't even know Brandon.
You mind if we take a look around?
Sure.
The woman says, I don't know a Brandon, I've never heard of a Brandon, and Brandon doesn't live here.
A quick glance around suggests she's telling the truth.
Yeah, I think we ought to put a call in on that one.
There's no sign that Brandon resides at this address.
Using Brandon's DMV records, police issue an alert for his vehicle.
The next morning, after the Be on the Lookout was issued, a patrol unit spotted a vehicle matching the description.
They pull the car over and ask him to come with them to the police department.
He's very combative, does not want to cooperate, and does not understand why police brought him in.
But his attitude changes when the detectives tell him why he's there.
Once he learns that Sabrina has been murdered, his entire tone changes.
She's dead? We was just supposed to go on a date. I just thought she stood me up.
Brandon felt like, well, maybe she just blew me off. And when he tried to call her, there was no response.
And that made you mad?
Not really.
Brandon tells police that they've only exchanged a few messages.
She made a post online, and I checked her profile, and I sent her a DM.
That was pretty much the extent of their communications.
So that's something you do often? You meet women online?
Wait, are you trying to pin this on me?
Brandon again becomes combative and says, I just met Sabrina. I wouldn't have any reason to harm her.
Am I under arrest?
No.
When they say no, Brandon tells police if they want to continue this conversation, they're going to have to get a warrant.
Then, as he turns to leave, Brandon says something that will shift the investigation into an entirely new direction.
I'm not the one you should be looking at.
He says you guys have the wrong guy.
You should be looking at Troy Parker.
Detectives investigating the murder of 19-year-old Sabrina Herrera have spent the last hour questioning Brandon Fuller, an older man she'd met online after breaking up with her longtime boyfriend, Troy Parker.
We was just supposed to go on a date. I just thought she stood me up.
Brandon seemed upset when the police told him Sabrina was dead, but he said he'd never met her in person.
Now, after detectives asked for an alibi, Brandon has stormed out of the interview.
Brandon eventually got to the point where it was, am I being arrested? If not, then you're gonna have to get a warrant to keep me here.
Police are concerned that Brandon's lack of helpfulness points to some type of guilt and that he was possibly involved in Sabrina's murder.
Detectives also aren't sure what to make of the last thing Brandon said as he walked out the door.
You should be looking at Troy Parker.
As he was leaving, he made a point to note that I'm not the one you should be looking at. You should be looking at her ex.
Detectives are surprised that he even knows about her ex. Had Sabrina told Brandon about Troy in their online chats?
Was it possible that Brandon knew something that the detectives didn't? Or was he just pointing his finger at Troy to take the heat off of himself?
Either way, detectives will need to follow up.
They want to take a look into Troy and see if there's any truth to the allegations made by Brandon.
Before detectives confront Troy, they reach out to other members of Sabrina's family with more questions.
Because Sabrina and Troy had been dating all through high school, Sabrina's family, in essence, watched Troy grow up as a member of their family.
No one had anything bad to say about Troy, and many of them were shocked when they had broken up.
Sensing they could be chasing a false lead, detectives decide to go straight to the source.
At that point, they went to Troy's home.
Troy was still living with his parents, so it was easy for police officers to find him.
We need to ask you a few questions about Sabrina.
Yeah, I heard about what happened.
He seemed concerned, but he was very flat in his demeanor.
They also noticed that, same as Brandon, he had a similar height and build to the man in the surveillance video.
We heard that you and Sabrina had broken up
a few weeks ago. We figured it was best.
Troy was clear that they had both agreed to go their separate ways and that he wanted to pursue football and that she had already started pursuing a career in nursing.
Troy says that their breakup was mutual, but he still cared about her.
Then he says something that catches their attention.
Well, when was the last time that you saw her?
She stopped by Monday afternoon.
Troy admits that he saw Sabrina a few hours before her body was found.
He said she dropped by his house to pick up a few of her things.
But she only stayed for like 15 minutes.
What did you do after she left?
Well, I had a game.
Troy said he went to go play football in Sienna Plantation.
The town of Sienna Plantation is about 20 minutes away from Troy's house.
He claimed he got there at a little after 3 o'clock.
Surveillance video from the crime scene had placed Sabrina's killer dumping her car at the same time.
Now, if what Troy was telling them was true, he couldn't have been the man in the surveillance video.
An alibi isn't all that Troy offers detectives.
Troy allowed police to look at his text messages.
Based on the messages, it appeared that the split really was amicable, just like everyone said.
There was nothing hostile between the two of them texting back and forth.
The texts also suggest he knew nothing about her death.
Police saw that Troy had texted Sabrina after she was found murdered.
Yeah, I was worried when she didn't text me back. I just kind of figured, maybe something was wrong with her phone.
The police, they're not having much reason to doubt Troy's version of events. He seems pretty genuine.
But they still need to check out his alibi, just to be certain.
Investigators went and spoke with Troy's teammates.
The police asked his friends, did Troy come and play with you? They corroborated, yes, he had gone to play with them.
However, their timeline differed from Troy's.
He showed up kind of late. About 4? About 4.
They said that Troy did play football, but it was after 4 p.m.
That hour difference could potentially change the game.
It gave him enough time to actually commit the murder.
Theoretically, Troy had time to abandon Sabrina's car, and go back and play football at Sienna Plantation.
His alibi is falling apart.
There may be something he's not telling us.
And it isn't long before the detectives learn just what that something is.
Sabrina's cousin came by the station.
She has information that could be helpful.
Sabrina had confided in her that Troy had been abusive.
She didn't want to tell me, but I saw what he had done to her.
Detectives in Missouri City, Texas have not only discovered that Sabrina Herrera's ex-boyfriend, Troy Parker, may have had the time to murder the teenager. Her cousin has also come forward with a shocking allegation.
Sabrina's cousin tells the investigators that Sabrina confided in her and told her that Troy had been abusive during their relationship.
She let her know that Troy became very jealous and possessive.
The news takes detectives by surprise.
Sabrina's mom had nothing but nice things to say about Troy and the way that he treated Sabrina.
I don't think they knew.
Sabrina's cousin knew the truth about what was really going on when everyone else thought this was just the ideal relationship.
According to Sabrina's cousin, as the high school sweethearts grew older, they grew apart.
Relationships are up and down. It's not always the fairy tale we think it is.
When you're dealing with domestic violence, usually you can boil down the motive to a few things. One is simply control. The abuser likes to control their victim.
It starts with small things, maybe with verbal aggressions or bullying, and we think it's gonna stop, and we think we can control it. But more often than not, it escalates.
And too often, it escalates in silence.
A lot of teenagers are not reporting what's going on with them.
They don't want to cause problems. They want people around them to feel as though everything is okay.
Sabrina's cousin says she'd only learned the truth by accident.
She didn't want to tell me, but I saw what he had done to her.
She had these bruises on her legs, and her cousin asked her, "What's this about?" She lied at first.
Sabrina brushed it off and said she had failed.
That's nothing, it was an accident.
That does not look like an accident. What happened?
Sabrina's cousin could tell she was hiding something.
After pressing her a little bit, she was able to get it out of Sabrina that Troy had hurt her.
Sabrina also admitted it wasn't the first time.
The abuse had been getting more violent as the relationship went on.
You need to do something about it.
I know.
And that was the real reason why they broke up.
She just couldn't take it anymore.
Their sights firmly set on Troy, detectives start digging into the teenager's past.
When the police run a background check on Troy, they didn't find an arrest record.
Troy has no criminal history.
However, they did find something that caught their attention.
3 months prior to Sabrina's murder, Troy had checked himself into a mental institution.
Troy checked himself into the hospital voluntarily for NSSI, non-suicidal self-injury, hurting himself without the intention to kill himself.
To get more details about Troy's mental health issues, detectives talked to doctors at the hospital that treated him.
The staff told them that Troy was battling depression, that Troy had cut himself.
He had sliced his wrist.
We didn't think it was a serious attempt to kill himself.
They didn't believe that Troy was suicidal, but that he wanted to feel something.
They said Troy spent the night at the hospital and he was discharged the next day.
We gave him some medication for his depression, and he checked out the next morning and never came back.
He never received the help that he needed to battle the mental health issues that he was dealing with.
With their suspicion of Troy increasing, detectives returned to the station and contact his cell provider.
Troy had showed them his text to Sabrina, but there may have been other potentially incriminating information in his phone.
Police get a subpoena to obtain Troy's phone records. They also are able to obtain his internet records.
Since Troy lives with his parents, detectives also subpoena the video from his family's home security system.
There was a camera in the front and then the camera in the back.
Typically, our home security cameras are rolling all day and night. We want to make sure that our homes feel secure. We want to know what's going on.
The whole purpose of even having a security camera is to capture everything.
But when police review the footage from the Parkers' house, they see that wasn't the case.
What the police noted is that for the date of the offense, the front camera was turned off at approximately, I believe, 11 a.m.
It doesn't start recording again until 8:11 p.m.
The camera at the rear continued recording, but the footage it captured was even more suspicious.
While the camera was running, there was something obscuring the lens.
You couldn't see who was coming in or out of that home. And when the officer rewinded the video, he noticed that on August the 26th, you see Troy Parker take a red towel and cover that particular camera.
There was something that Troy was trying to hide during that time period.
But he can't hide what he's been doing on his computer.
Some concerning things popped up in his search history.
For example, extradition laws.
He had looked up things like how to get a passport, what countries don't have an extradition treaty.
And he was also researching how to rob a bank.
It was clear to detectives that Troy was going to be on the run.
But was he planning something else first?
The most disturbing thing that police found in Troy's search history was that Troy had been researching serial killers.
Was Sabrina's murder the start of a killing spree?
Detectives investigating Sabrina Herrera's murder have learned her ex-boyfriend, Troy Parker, has been researching guns, serial killers, and countries without an extradition treaty with the U.S.
It appears that Troy was planning to commit a murder and how to get away with it.
At this point, police have enough to get an arrest warrant.
Based on his search history, they were worried he may kill again.
But before they can get a judge to sign the warrant, they get an unexpected call.
They received the phone call at approximately 11 p.m. that night. It was from Troy's brother.
Troy's brother said Troy has more information for police.
15 minutes later, Troy and his family arrive at the police station. The officers lead Troy into the interrogation room.
Once detectives finish reading Troy his rights, they get straight to the point.
Troy tells officers he wants to confess to a murder.
He proceeds to tell them that he was the one who killed Sabrina.
So what happened? What's wrong with it?
He tells the police that, yes, Sabrina did come to my house that day.
And so she voluntarily came over? I mean, yeah, I asked you to come over. Okay.
There's no way she went to that house thinking, my life's going to end today. No way. Despite the abuse, she did not think that he would go that far.
But Troy says that while she was there, they had begun to argue.
Why are you always disrespecting me?
He felt like she was cheating on him.
How do you know she was with other guys? Because I'll ask you, and then I'll see it on like social media or something.
We broke up!
Sabrina thought they had broken up, but apparently that hadn't gotten through to Troy.
You know what? Get out!
Troy, serious?
Get out!
Troy said that he was so angry and so mad at Sabrina that he told her to get out.
But it was too late.
I could feel like my body just, like it was just getting hot, like my body was just getting hot.
As Sabrina is leaving the house, Troy begins to feel overwhelmed with anger.
In that moment of anger, he saw a bungee cord on top of the refrigerator.
He grabbed the bungee cord and he began to strangle her.
Troy, look! Stop!
Troy admits that Sabrina didn't die easily.
Troy told the officers that at some point in time, he stopped strangling Sabrina. And at that point, Sabrina was still alive.
Did she say anything? She said, please.
At that point, he thought, should I stop? But then he said he knew what he had to do. And he continued to strangle her until Sabrina was dead.
Troy says that once he was sure Sabrina was dead, he tried to hide what he'd done.
First, he took the red towel that detectives seen him use to cover up the surveillance camera in the backyard outside.
Then he came back in and dragged Sabrina's body out to her car and put it in the trunk.
Then he drove around the neighborhood, looking for a place to get rid of the body.
I just go down the street, and I just found a place that was kind of dead end.
That fits with the surveillance video showing Troy parking and fleeing from the scene.
Troy said that after he left the car with Sabrina's body in the trunk, he went home and he burned the bungee cord, the gloves, and his pants in the fire pit in the backyard.
However, while Troy admitted to trying to cover up the murder, he denied planning it ahead of time.
Was it just something that you have been thinking about? I used to try not to think much day to day because I didn't know how long my mind is. What do you think should happen to you? I should die.
Most crimes of passions, their conscience gets to them. It starts to eat away.
At the end of the interview, detectives take Troy into custody.
The police arrested Troy for murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse.
But will Troy's precarious mental state stand in the way of a conviction?
Based on the evidence and the covering up cameras, his lawyer would have a hard time proving that this was an act of insanity.
There were also his actions after the murder, both attempting to cover it up and ultimately confessing.
He's obviously feeling remorseful, knowing that he did something wrong. A trial is for someone who is trying to prove their innocence.
So, in October of 2019, Troy agrees to a plea deal.
In exchange for pleading guilty, he receives a reduced sentence of 45 years in prison.
It gives him a chance at life after prison. He was 20 years old. 45 years allows him to be released at prison at the age of 65.
There's no number that this defendant can get that's gonna bring your loved one back. He could get 99 years in prison, he can get life in prison. You might feel good for a little bit, but afterwards, your baby girl, she's not coming back.
Although friends and family hope that Sabrina's story and Troy's can help others.
Dating violence in young teens, unfortunately, is very common, but it goes unreported. And mental health, unfortunately, is still very taboo, and a lot of people don't want to talk about it. And I know that's a touchy subject, but I think it's important as a community and as families, we have those conversations about mental illness. Whether they're uncomfortable, whether they paint us in the best light, it's important that we discuss those things.
Otherwise, the cost may be more than we can bear.
So much hurt and pain reverberates, not only through the families, but through the community.
Sabrina was a wonderful young lady. She was loved. You could tell that when Sabrina died, a piece of them died too.
The flashing blue lights were meant to stop a speeding car, nothing more. On a humid Florida night, the kind where the air hangs heavy over dark highways and the distant buzz of cicadas never seems to fade, a routine traffic stop unfolded like thousands before it. A patrol officer stepped out of his cruiser, expecting the usual exchange, license, registration, maybe a warning, maybe a ticket. Instead, that moment would ignite a chain reaction reaching back more than 2 decades, reopening a case the community had quietly buried beneath years of unanswered questions. What began as a minor violation would expose something far darker, a ghost of 2003 that had haunted a small Florida town for far too long. Back in the spring of that year, the town of Clearwater Springs, quiet, sunlit, and seemingly untouched by violent crime, was shaken by a disappearance that made local headlines overnight. Residents locked their doors a little earlier, parents waited at bus stops a little longer, and neighbors began to look at each other with a cautious curiosity that hadn't existed before. The missing person was 27-year-old Melissa Carter, a local waitress known for her quick smile and her habit of greeting nearly every customer by name. She lived in a modest apartment near the edge of town and worked late shifts at a diner that stayed open past midnight for truckers and night owls. On the evening she vanished, nothing seemed unusual. Coworkers remembered her laughing behind the counter, complaining about the heat, talking about plans to visit her sister the following weekend. Then, sometime after midnight, Melissa clocked out and stepped into the Florida night. Surveillance cameras from a nearby gas station captured a grainy glimpse of her walking toward the parking lot where her old blue sedan waited beneath a flickering light. That was the last confirmed sighting anyone would ever see for years. When she failed to show up for work the next day and didn't answer calls from friends, concern turned quickly into alarm. By the second day, missing person flyers appeared on telephone poles and storefront windows across Clearwater Springs. The town that had always felt safe suddenly felt smaller, quieter, uneasy. Police began with the obvious questions. Where had she gone after leaving work? Did she meet someone? Did she plan to travel? Detectives spoke with coworkers, friends, and regular customers at the diner. They combed through Melissa's apartment, searching for signs of struggle or clues to a sudden departure. Everything seemed ordinary. Her purse was missing, but most of her belongings were untouched. Her car, strangely, was not found in the diner parking lot the next morning. It had vanished along with her. Days turned into weeks and the search widened. Volunteers combed nearby fields and wooded areas. Officers dragged shallow ponds and canals that crisscrossed the outskirts of town. Helicopters scanned patches of marshland where thick vegetation swallowed sound and light alike. But every search ended the same way, nothing. No car, no trace of Melissa Carter. No clear sign of what had happened during those silent hours after midnight. The disappearance quickly became Clearwater Springs' most disturbing mystery. Local news stations ran the story repeatedly. Young woman vanishes after work, no witnesses, no leads. Detectives publicly insisted the investigation remained active, yet privately they faced the same frustrating void. There was no obvious suspect. Melissa had no known enemies, no history of dangerous relationships, no record of threats or disputes. Friends described her life as simple and steady. She worked long hours, saved money, and spent weekends with family. Then came the first strange clue. Nearly 2 weeks after Melissa disappeared, a fisherman discovered something unusual along a narrow canal about 15 miles outside town. It was her car, partially submerged in muddy water, the front end angled downward into the reeds. The vehicle looked abandoned rather than wrecked, its doors closed, its windows intact. When investigators pulled it from the canal, the mystery only deepened. Inside the car there were no signs of violence. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, still containing cash and identification. The keys were missing. Melissa herself was nowhere to be found. The discovery transformed the missing person case into something far more troubling. Detectives began to suspect that Melissa had been forced to stop somewhere along that lonely stretch of road before her car ended up in the canal. Tire tracks nearby suggested another vehicle might have been present, though heavy rain had washed away much of the evidence before investigators arrived. Without witnesses or clear forensic proof, the theory remained just that, a theory. Rumors spread quickly through Clearwater Springs. Some residents believed a stranger passing through town had abducted her. Others whispered about someone local, someone who knew the area well enough to hide evidence and disappear into the quiet landscape. Each new tip raised hope for a moment before fading into another dead end. Months passed. The headlines grew smaller. Melissa's family continued searching, appearing on television appeals and organizing community vigils. Candlelight gatherings filled the town square, residents standing silently with photographs of the smiling waitress who had once served them coffee at midnight. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, her sister placed fresh flowers near the canal where the car had been found, refusing to let the memory fade. Inside the police department, the file grew thick but stagnant. Detectives chased every lead they could find. A man questioned in a neighboring county. A suspicious vehicle reported near the diner that night. A former coworker who abruptly moved out of state weeks after Melissa vanished. Each possibility collapsed under closer scrutiny. The investigation slowly lost momentum, not because officers stopped caring, but because there was simply nothing solid left to follow. By the 5th year, the case had quietly become what investigators dread the most, a cold case. The file was boxed, labeled, and placed among dozens of other unresolved mysteries waiting for something unlikely, a new witness, a forgotten piece of evidence, a confession that might never come. Yet the town never truly forgot. People still spoke about that night in low voices at grocery stores and gas stations. Parents reminded teenagers not to walk alone after dark. New residents occasionally heard the story from neighbors who described it with the same lingering disbelief. A woman disappears, a car found in a canal, and no one ever answers for it. The years continued to pass. Streets were repaved, businesses changed ownership, and the diner where Melissa had worked eventually closed its doors. Younger residents grew up hearing about the case as a cautionary legend, something that happened long ago before they were old enough to remember. For many in Clearwater Springs, the mystery became part of the town's identity, a shadow behind the sunny beaches and quiet neighborhoods. Inside the evidence room of the county sheriff's office, Melissa Carter's file remained untouched for long stretches of time. Investigators occasionally reopened it, reviewing photographs and reports, hoping fresh eyes might notice something previously overlooked. But each review ended with the same conclusion. Without new evidence or a credible suspect, the truth remained buried somewhere in the past. Meanwhile, the man who would eventually become central to the story lived quietly elsewhere in Florida, blending into the ordinary rhythm of everyday life. He held steady jobs, paid bills, exchanged polite greetings with neighbors. Nothing about his routine hinted at the violent secret that would one day surface. For years, he remained completely invisible to the investigation, just another anonymous resident among millions in the state. Then, one summer night decades later, a patrol officer spotted a car drifting slightly across a lane line on a highway miles away from Clearwater Springs. The driver corrected the vehicle quickly, but the movement was enough to justify a stop. Blue lights flashed. The car slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. What followed seemed routine at first. The officer approached cautiously, shining a flashlight through the driver's window. The man behind the wheel appeared calm, almost indifferent. He handed over his license without hesitation. But as the officer ran the identification through the system, a quiet alert appeared. Nothing dramatic, just a small note tied to an old investigative database. A name. A connection buried deep in records few people remembered. The officer didn't know it yet, but that simple traffic stop had just brushed against a case that had slept for more than 20 years, a mystery that had left a permanent scar on a small Florida town. And within hours, detectives who thought the trail had vanished forever would begin to realize that the past had never truly disappeared at all. The patrol officer stared at the small alert on the screen longer than expected. It wasn't the kind of warning that demanded immediate action, no flashing notice of a violent warrant or a dangerous fugitive. Instead, it was something quieter, something easy to overlook, a cross-reference tied to an archived investigative database maintained by the state. A name linked to a decades-old inquiry. The officer glanced back toward the vehicle idling on the shoulder, the driver waiting patiently under the wash of blue lights. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. Mid-50s, thinning hair, tired eyes reflecting the glow of the dashboard. The sort of man you might pass in a grocery store aisle without ever noticing. Yet the note on the screen tugged at the officer's curiosity just enough to pause the routine flow of the stop. He walked back toward the car and leaned slightly toward the open window. The driver introduced himself calmly as Daniel Hargrove, explaining he had been driving home from a late shift at a warehouse outside Tampa. His voice carried the relaxed tone of someone who believed the encounter would end with a warning and nothing more. The officer asked a few standard questions, checking for signs of intoxication or nervousness, but Hargrove remained steady, cooperative, almost indifferent. When asked if he had any outstanding legal issues, he shook his head slowly. "Nothing serious," he said, "just an old traffic ticket years ago." The officer returned to the cruiser again, tapping through the database to see exactly why the name had appeared in connection with an investigation so old it barely existed in digital records. The system pulled fragments of information from archived files, references to a missing person case in Clearwater Springs, Florida, 2003. Melissa Carter. The connection was thin, almost insignificant. Hargrove's name appeared in an early interview log as someone who had once frequented the diner where Melissa worked. That was all. Hundreds of people had passed through that diner during the months before she disappeared. Being mentioned in a witness list hardly meant anything. Still, something about the coincidence felt strange. Clearwater Springs was more than 200 miles away from the current traffic stop. The case itself had been dormant for years, its file likely collecting dust in some county storage room. Yet here was a man casually pulled over on a Florida highway whose name had once been scribbled into that investigation. The officer knew it could easily be nothing at all, but the curiosity lingered. He radioed dispatch and asked for a quick check to confirm whether the archived connection meant anything significant. Dispatch responded after a short pause. The name had indeed appeared in the old case, but not as a suspect. According to the record summary, Hargrove had been interviewed briefly because he lived near the diner at the time and was known to stop there late at night. Detectives back then had considered him cooperative and cleared him within days. There had been no reason to pursue him further. Under normal circumstances, that information would have ended the matter. A man interviewed 20 years ago about a missing person case was hardly unusual. Yet as the officer prepared to close the stop with a simple warning, another thought surfaced. Over the past decade, many cold cases across the country had been reopened thanks to advances in forensic technology. DNA databases had expanded. Evidence, once considered useless, had suddenly become valuable. The officer wondered, almost idly, whether the Clearwater Springs case had ever been reviewed again under those new methods. He decided to make one more call before letting Hargrove go. Through dispatch, he contacted a supervisor in the County Records Division, asking whether the Melissa Carter case still existed in active archives. The response came back unexpectedly fast. Not only did the file still exist, but it had recently been flagged for a preliminary review by the state's cold case unit. The officer felt a flicker of curiosity sharpen into something closer to instinct. Meanwhile, Daniel Hargrove sat quietly in his car, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. Passing vehicles roared by in the darkness, headlights streaking across the roadside like brief flashes of white lightning. To him, the stop felt longer than it should have, but he showed no visible irritation. When the officer finally approached again, Hargrove offered a faint smile and asked if everything was all right. The officer returned his license and registration but added one more question, casual in tone yet deliberate. Had he ever lived in Clearwater Springs? Hargrove hesitated for just a fraction of a second, the smallest pause before answering yes. Many years ago, he explained, early 2000s. He had worked odd construction jobs around the area before eventually moving away. The officer asked if he remembered a woman named Melissa Carter. Hargrove's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The name seemed to drift through his memory, like a distant echo. After a moment, he nodded slowly. She worked at a diner, he said. Everyone in town had heard about her disappearance back then. It had been tragic. Terrible thing. The officer studied his face carefully. The response sounded rehearsed in its calmness, yet nothing overtly suspicious appeared. Hargrove maintained eye contact, speaking in the same steady tone as before. To any casual observer, he looked like a man recalling an unfortunate local story from decades past. Still, the officer decided not to end the interaction immediately. He asked if Hargrove had known Melissa personally. The man shrugged lightly. Not really. Just a waitress who served coffee sometimes. He claimed he barely remembered details of the investigation. It had been a long time ago. The explanation matched what little the database had shown. Hargrove had indeed been one of dozens of customers interviewed because they were known to visit the diner during late hours. Back then, detectives had quickly ruled out many of them, overwhelmed by the lack of evidence pointing anywhere specific. The case had stalled within months. Yet something about the quiet highway stop lingered in the officer's mind. Maybe it was the way Hargrove answered too smoothly, or perhaps it was the coincidence itself, an archived witness appearing again after 20 years during an otherwise random encounter. Before stepping away, the officer asked one final question that seemed harmless on the surface. Did Hargrove still travel through Clearwater Springs from time to time? The man shook his head. No reason to go back there anymore, he said. Life had moved on. The officer nodded and told him he was free to leave with just a warning for drifting across the lane. Hargrove thanked him politely, started the engine, and merged back onto the dark highway. Within seconds, his taillights disappeared into the distance. For most traffic stops, that would have been the end of the story. But as the officer drove away, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he had just brushed against something larger than a simple coincidence. Later that night, during a break at the station, he opened the archived database again and searched the name Daniel Hargrove more carefully. The fragments of information painted a quiet life that stretched across several Florida counties over 2 decades. Warehouse work, short-term construction jobs, a few minor citations, nothing serious. Yet buried deep in the records was something new the officer hadn't noticed earlier. A recent entry from the state cold case unit requesting access to old evidence tied to Melissa Carter's disappearance. The timing struck him as odd. Why reopen the case now, after so many years of silence? The officer picked up the phone and left a brief message with the cold case division, mentioning that he had just encountered someone connected to the old file. He didn't expect much to come of it. Still, protocol encouraged officers to pass along anything remotely relevant when a case was under review. Days later, detectives in the cold case unit listened to that message and immediately recognized the name. Daniel Hargrove had resurfaced in their research only weeks earlier while they were re-examining witness lists from the original investigation. Back in 2003, he had been one of the last customers recorded leaving the diner before Melissa Carter finished her shift. At the time, the detail meant little because so many people had come and gone that night. But modern investigative tools allowed detectives to reconstruct timelines with greater precision. What truly caught their attention, however, was something even older hidden in the evidence archive. Among the items recovered from Melissa's car when it was pulled from the canal were several partial fingerprints lifted from the passenger door and interior handle. In 2003, those prints had been run through databases, but produced no matches. Technology back then simply wasn't capable of extracting usable results from such degraded samples. Now, 20 years later, forensic software had improved dramatically. The cold case unit had begun reprocessing those fingerprints using updated scanning systems capable of identifying patterns previously dismissed as incomplete. When investigators fed the recovered prints into the modern database, a faint but promising match had begun to appear. The name attached to that emerging match was Daniel Hargrove. At first, detectives assumed it must be coincidence. After all, Hargrove had admitted visiting the diner occasionally, so his prints being somewhere near Melissa's car might not be unusual. But the more analysts studied the patterns, the more confident they became that the prints had not come from the outside of the vehicle where a casual touch might occur. They had been lifted from inside the passenger door, the exact place someone would grip when opening the car from the outside and climbing in. The discovery alone wasn't proof of a crime. Yet combined with the timeline placing Hargrove near the diner on the night Melissa vanished, it created a question investigators could no longer ignore. For 2 decades, the case had drifted in darkness with no clear direction. Now, suddenly, a routine traffic stop had brought a forgotten name back into the light, and detectives began to wonder if the quiet man driving through the Florida night had been carrying a secret far older than anyone realized. Detectives in the state cold case unit sat in a quiet office lined with gray filing cabinets and humming computers, staring at a case file that had not held real promise in more than 20 years. The name Daniel Hargrove now circled the center of their attention like a slow-moving storm cloud gathering weight. For decades, the investigation into Melissa Carter's disappearance had floated between speculation and silence, but the fingerprint analysis had introduced something investigators had never possessed before: physical evidence that placed a specific individual inside her vehicle. The print was partial, faint, degraded by time and exposure, yet the forensic match probability was strong enough to demand further examination. It was the first tangible thread in a mystery that had resisted explanation since 2003. The detectives began rebuilding the timeline from the ground up, refusing to rely solely on conclusions drawn years earlier. They reopened witness statements, reviewed photographs, and studied maps of Clearwater Springs as it had looked back then. The diner where Melissa worked was long gone, replaced by a small pharmacy, but archived images revealed the layout of the parking lot and surrounding streets. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station had once shown Melissa walking toward her car shortly after midnight. That moment, captured in grainy black and white frames, had always been considered the last clear trace of her movements. Now investigators wanted to know who else had been nearby during those same minutes. Old records showed that Daniel Hargrove lived less than a mile from the diner in 2003. He rented a modest house along a narrow road lined with palm trees and aging fences. According to employment logs obtained during the original investigation, he worked irregular shifts for a local construction contractor. Several coworkers had mentioned that Hargrove occasionally stopped at the diner late at night after finishing jobs. That detail had seemed ordinary at the time. Dozens of workers and truck drivers did the same thing every evening. But one detail buried in an interview transcript caught the attention of the cold case team. A co-worker had once mentioned seeing Hargrove at the diner on the very night Melissa disappeared. The comment had been written in the margin of a detective's notebook, but never pursued aggressively because it simply placed Hargrove among many other customers present earlier in the evening. Investigators in 2003 had believed Melissa left the diner alone long after most customers had gone. With new forensic evidence pointing toward Hargrove, the old timeline suddenly demanded closer scrutiny. Analysts began re-examining the grainy surveillance images frame by frame, enhancing them with modern digital tools. The camera from the gas station had not captured the diner parking lot directly, but it did show the adjacent road, where vehicles occasionally passed under a streetlight. In one particular frame recorded just minutes before Melissa walked to her car, a pickup truck moved slowly through the intersection near the diner. The image was blurry, the license plate unreadable, but the vehicle's shape and distinctive dent on the rear bumper stood out clearly enough to notice. Detectives compared the shape to vehicle records from 2003. Daniel Hargrove had owned a pickup truck at the time, an older model Ford with a documented repair report showing damage to the rear bumper months earlier. The resemblance was not proof, but it deepened the sense that the investigation was finally pointing in a specific direction. The cold case team requested additional forensic testing on evidence recovered from Melissa's car. When it had been pulled from the canal decades earlier, technicians collected fibers, fingerprints, and small debris from inside the vehicle. Much of that material had been stored carefully in sealed containers. In 2003, many of those samples had been considered too degraded for meaningful analysis. Technology had changed dramatically since then. Forensic specialists began extracting microscopic traces from the preserved evidence, scanning for DNA fragments that might have survived years of storage. The process took weeks. Each sample was carefully cataloged and run through advanced sequencing equipment capable of isolating even tiny biological remnants. While the lab work continued, detectives focused on reconstructing Hargrove's life after he left Clearwater Springs. Public records showed he moved frequently across Florida during the following years, working in warehouses, construction sites, and shipping yards. He had no serious criminal record, only minor traffic violations and occasional noise complaints. Neighbors described him as quiet and reserved, someone who kept to himself but caused no obvious trouble. That quietness made the situation even more unsettling. Cold case investigators understood that many violent crimes were committed by individuals who appeared outwardly ordinary. The absence of a criminal record did not eliminate suspicion, especially when physical evidence began pointing in one direction. Detectives eventually located several former co-workers who remembered Hargrove from the early 2000s. Some interviews produced little useful information, but a few recollections stood out. One man recalled that Hargrove had abruptly quit his job about a week after Melissa Carter vanished. At the time, he claimed he had found better work in another county. The sudden departure had not seemed suspicious then, but looking back years later, the timing felt uncomfortable. Another witness remembered something stranger. During the days following Melissa's disappearance, when the entire town was discussing the case, Hargrove reportedly told co-workers he believed she had probably left voluntarily. The statement itself was not unusual. Many people had speculated about that possibility early in the investigation, but the witness recalled Hargrove speaking with an unusual certainty, almost dismissive of the growing concern around town. As detectives gathered these fragments, the case slowly transformed from a cold mystery into a developing investigation. Yet they understood that suspicion alone could not solve a crime that old. They needed definitive evidence linking Hargrove to Melissa Carter's disappearance. Then the forensic lab delivered the first breakthrough. Among the preserved samples taken from inside Melissa's vehicle, analysts had located a small cluster of skin cells embedded along the interior passenger door handle. Using modern DNA amplification methods, technicians managed to extract a partial genetic profile from the degraded material. The sequence was incomplete, but still suitable for comparison. Investigators obtained a legal order to collect a fresh DNA sample from Daniel Hargrove, using the minor traffic stop as justification to bring him in for a brief follow-up interview connected to an old witness list review. When detectives approached him days later, Hargrove appeared mildly confused but cooperative. He agreed to provide the sample, insisting he barely remembered details of the long-ago case. The laboratory comparison took less than 48 hours. When the results arrived, the cold case unit gathered quietly around the printed report. The partial DNA profile recovered from the passenger door handle of Melissa Carter's car matched Daniel Hargrove with extremely high probability. The odds of the sample belonging to someone else were astronomically low. For the first time in 20 years, the investigation had a direct forensic link connecting a specific individual to the victim's vehicle on the night she disappeared. But the discovery raised a deeper question that detectives now had to confront carefully. If Hargrove's DNA and fingerprints were both inside the car, what had actually happened during those silent minutes after Melissa left the diner? Did she know him well enough to let him into the vehicle willingly, or had something far more sinister occurred on that lonely stretch of road? Investigators reviewed the geography again. The canal where the car was found lay along a rarely traveled route leading away from town, a place where headlights rarely appeared after midnight. Tire tracks discovered back in 2003 had hinted that another vehicle might have been present before heavy rain erased the patterns. That second vehicle could easily have been the pickup truck seen passing the intersection near the diner. The scenario forming in detectives' minds was chillingly simple. Melissa leaves work, walks toward her car under the flickering parking lot light, unaware that someone nearby is watching. A familiar customer approaches, someone she recognizes from the diner, someone who might ask for a ride or a brief conversation. She unlocks the door. He enters the passenger seat. From that moment forward, everything disappears into darkness. The car eventually ends up in the canal, carefully positioned rather than violently crashed. Melissa herself vanishes completely. No body, no confirmed sightings, no explanation for decades. Detectives knew they were approaching a decisive moment. Confronting Daniel Hargrove would require precision and patience. A direct accusation without additional context could push him into silence or legal defense. Instead, they planned to slowly rebuild the story piece by piece during a formal interview, presenting evidence only when the time was right. For the family of Melissa Carter, the sudden movement in the investigation felt almost unreal. After 20 years of uncertainty, hope and dread collided in equal measure. The possibility that the truth might finally emerge carried a heavy emotional weight. And somewhere in Florida, Daniel Hargrove continued his quiet routines, perhaps believing that the past had been safely buried beneath time and distance. But the evidence locked inside an old car pulled from a muddy canal had waited patiently for technology to catch up. Now that patience was over, and the silence surrounding the 2003 disappearance was beginning to crack. The interview room was small, windowless, and quiet enough that every movement seemed amplified. Daniel Hargrove sat at the metal table with his hands folded loosely in front of him, his posture calm but alert, the kind of composure that detectives had seen countless times before in people who believed they could talk their way through difficult questions. A recorder rested on the table between him and the investigators, its small red light glowing steadily as the conversation began. At first, the discussion followed the expected path of routine inquiry. Detectives explained that the State Cold Case Unit had recently reopened several unresolved investigations from the early 2000s and were reviewing old witness lists to clarify details that might have been overlooked. Hargrove nodded politely, repeating what he had said during the traffic stop days earlier. Yes, he remembered the diner in Clearwater Springs. Yes, he remembered Melissa Carter vaguely. She served him coffee a few times. He remembered hearing about the disappearance on the news like everyone else. It had shocked the town. Terrible situation. The detectives listened carefully, letting the words settle in the quiet room. They asked him to describe his life in Clearwater Springs during that period. Hargrove spoke calmly about construction jobs, long hours, and small paychecks. He explained that he rented a house nearby and occasionally stopped at the diner after late shifts. His voice carried the same steady tone as before, controlled and deliberate. There was no sign of agitation or panic. If he felt any anxiety about the direction of the interview, he hid it well. One of the detectives asked about the night Melissa disappeared. Hargrove leaned back slightly in the chair and shook his head slowly. It had been a long time, he said. 2 decades had blurred most of those memories. He believed he had been working late that evening and probably stopped at the diner earlier in the night like he often did. But he insisted he had left long before Melissa finished her shift. After that, he drove home and went to sleep. He said the next thing he remembered about the case was hearing the news the following day when coworkers mentioned the missing waitress. The investigators exchanged brief glances but said nothing. Instead, they continued building the conversation gradually, asking about his truck, the old pickup he drove back then. Hargrove confirmed he owned one. An older Ford, nothing special. He said he eventually sold it years ago when it became too expensive to repair. The detective nodded as if the answer were expected. Then the conversation shifted. One of the investigators reached into a folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a still image taken from the enhanced surveillance footage near the diner in 2003. The pickup truck in the picture was grainy but recognizable, its rear bumper bent inward at a slight angle. The detective asked Hargrove if the vehicle looked familiar. Hargrove studied the photograph for several seconds. His expression remained mostly neutral, but the pause lasted just long enough to register. Finally, he shrugged lightly and said it could be his old truck, though the image was too blurry to be certain. The detectives did not challenge the answer immediately. Instead, they asked whether he remembered seeing Melissa Carter in the parking lot that night. Hargrove shook his head again. No, he said. If he had seen her leaving work, he probably would have remembered. The room remained silent for a moment before the second detective spoke again. This time the tone was slightly firmer. He explained that investigators had recently reviewed forensic evidence from Melissa's car, evidence that had been preserved since the vehicle was recovered from the canal. Advances in technology, he said, allowed analysts to re-examine fingerprints and DNA that earlier investigators had not been able to fully identify. Hargrove's posture shifted subtly in the chair. It was the first visible change in his calm demeanor. The detective continued speaking in an even voice. He described how technicians had recovered fingerprints from the interior passenger door handle of Melissa's vehicle. Those prints, he said, had now been matched to Daniel Hargrove. For the first time since the interview began, the silence that followed carried a different weight. Hargrove inhaled slowly, then leaned forward with his hands still folded together. He did not immediately deny the statement. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Was it possible the prints were there because he had simply touched the car at some earlier time? Maybe when she parked near the diner, or what he walked past in the lot. The detective replied calmly that the prints were not located on the exterior of the vehicle where a casual touch might occur. They were found inside the passenger door, exactly where someone would grip the handle while entering the car. The room grew very quiet again. Hargrove shifted in his seat, his eyes moving briefly toward the recorder on the table before returning to the detectives. He said he did not remember getting into Melissa's car, but admitted that 20 years was a long time and memories could be unreliable. Perhaps she had offered him a short ride somewhere, he suggested, though he could not recall the details clearly. The explanation sounded hesitant, a subtle departure from the confident certainty he had shown earlier. The investigators noticed the change immediately but continued their careful approach. One of them slid another document across the table. This one contained the laboratory report comparing DNA samples recovered from the same door handle with the reference sample Hargrove had provided days earlier. The numbers and charts on the page were technical and precise, leaving little room for doubt. The detective summarized the findings in plain language. The DNA extracted from the passenger door matched Hargrove with extremely high probability. Hargrove looked down at the report without touching it. The calm mask that had defined his expression began to show faint cracks around the edges. His jaw tightened slightly as he considered the information. The detectives waited. After nearly half a minute of silence, Hargrove spoke again, this time more slowly. If his DNA was in the car, he said, then perhaps Melissa had given him a ride home at some point. Maybe that night. Maybe another night. He insisted he never hurt her and had no idea what happened after she dropped him off. The explanation introduced a new claim that had never appeared in the original investigation. In 2003, Hargrove had told detectives he barely knew Melissa and had never been inside her car. Now, confronted with forensic evidence, the story had shifted. The investigators gently pointed out the inconsistency. Hargrove responded by saying he might have forgotten details during the earlier interview because he was nervous. The case had frightened everyone in town at the time, he explained. People worried they might somehow be suspected just for knowing the victim. The detectives listened carefully, but continued pressing the timeline. If Melissa had given him a ride that night, where exactly had she taken him? Which road had they driven? What time did he leave the vehicle? Hargrove hesitated before answering. He could not remember clearly, he said again. It had been too long. The investigators then revealed another detail from the reopened investigation. Analysts had reconstructed Melissa's probable route based on the location where her car was later found in the canal. That route did not pass near Hargrove's house. For the first time, his composure faltered visibly. The silence stretched across the small interview room like a tightening wire. Outside the building, the afternoon sun continued its slow descent across the Florida sky, but inside the windowless room, time seemed suspended around the fragile balance of the conversation. One of the detectives leaned forward slightly and spoke in a quieter tone. He explained that investigators now believed Melissa Carter had encountered someone she recognized shortly after leaving the diner. Someone who entered her vehicle willingly or by persuasion. That person's fingerprints and DNA had been preserved on the passenger door handle for more than 20 years. Then he looked directly at Daniel Hargrove. The detective said the evidence suggested Hargrove was the last person known to be inside Melissa's car before it ended up in the canal. Hargrove stared at the table, without speaking. The detectives waited again, knowing that moments like this often determined whether a suspect chose to maintain denial or begin unraveling under the weight of facts. Every unanswered question about the night of 2003 now hovered in the room, pressing against the quiet. Somewhere in Clearwater Springs, Melissa Carter's family had spent 2 decades wondering what happened during those missing hours after midnight. Now the man sitting across the table might hold the answer that had haunted an entire community. And the silence inside that interview room was beginning to feel less like hesitation and more like the slow approach of a truth that could no longer stay buried. The silence in the interview room stretched long enough that even the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed unusually loud. Daniel Hargrove remained motionless in his chair, his gaze fixed somewhere on the metal surface of the table as if searching for an answer hidden within its dull reflection. For years he had lived quietly, untouched by the investigation that once briefly brushed against his life in 2003. Now, Surrounded by 2 detectives and a growing stack of forensic reports, the past had suddenly returned with a weight he could no longer ignore. One of the investigators broke the silence carefully, not with an accusation, but with a simple statement. They told Hargrove that the investigation was no longer operating on guesses or fading memories. Physical evidence had connected him directly to Melissa Carter's car on the night she vanished. Fingerprints, DNA, witness timelines. All of it pointed in the same direction. The detective spoke calmly, almost gently, explaining that after 20 years the goal was no longer just solving a case file, but giving a family answers they had waited decades to hear. Hargrove inhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling as though he were measuring each breath. His hands, which had rested loosely on the table earlier, now clasped together more tightly. For the first time since the interview began, there was a visible strain in his posture. He spoke quietly at first, his voice slightly rougher than before. He said that the detectives were making a mistake, that he had never harmed Melissa Carter. He insisted that if his DNA was in the car, it must have been from some harmless interaction. Maybe she offered him a ride that night after he finished eating at the diner. Maybe he simply opened the passenger door while they talked. He repeated that he could not remember clearly. The detectives listened patiently, but continued guiding the conversation toward the unanswered questions that had haunted the case for 2 decades. They asked him again about the timeline. If Melissa had driven him somewhere that night, why had her car been found 15 miles away in a canal along a road that did not lead toward his home? Why had he told investigators in 2003 that he had never been inside her vehicle? Hargrove did not answer immediately. The room filled again with the quiet pressure of the moment. Finally, he leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly, as if the effort of holding his story together had become heavier than expected. The detective across from him spoke again, this time introducing a detail that had not yet been mentioned during the interview. Analysts reviewing the case had recently examined phone records from 2003 that were preserved in archived billing files. Melissa Carter's phone had received a brief call earlier that evening from a number associated with a prepaid mobile device. That number, investigators explained, had been traced through old service records and eventually connected to a retail purchase made by Daniel Hargrove. The statement landed heavily in the room. Hargrove's eyes lifted from the table for the first time in several minutes. The calm composure he had displayed earlier seemed to drain slowly from his expression. He opened his mouth as if preparing to respond, then stopped, the words dissolving before they could form. The detectives continued carefully. The call had lasted less than 30 seconds, they said, just long enough for someone to arrange a brief meeting or conversation. Melissa had ended her shift less than an hour later. They did not accuse him directly. They simply allowed the evidence to settle in the space between them. Hargrove rubbed his hands together slowly, the movement almost absent-minded, as if he were trying to warm them despite the steady air conditioning in the room. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less confident and more uncertain. He admitted that he might have called Melissa that night. He said he had been drinking earlier and may have asked if she could give him a ride somewhere after work. According to his new version of events, she agreed to meet him in the parking lot once her shift ended. When she came outside, he approached her car and got into the passenger seat. The detectives listened without interruption. Hargrove continued, describing a short drive along the edge of town. He said they talked casually, nothing serious, until an argument began unexpectedly. He claimed Melissa became upset about something he said, though he could not explain exactly what triggered the tension. According to his story, she pulled the car over near the road that eventually led toward the canal and demanded that he get out. He insisted he did exactly that. He said he stepped out of the vehicle, slammed the passenger door, and watched as Melissa drove away alone into the darkness. The detectives allowed a moment to pass before responding. One of them asked a simple question. If that was true, why had he never mentioned the ride during the original investigation? Why had he told detectives in 2003 that he barely knew Melissa and had never been inside her car? Hargrove hesitated again, his explanation coming slowly and without conviction. He said he panicked when the news of her disappearance spread across town. He worried that admitting he had been with her shortly before she vanished would make him look guilty. So he kept quiet about the ride and hoped the investigation would eventually move in another direction. The story might have sounded plausible, if not for one critical problem. The detective leaned forward slightly and spoke in a steady voice. They had examined the canal site again after reopening the case. Modern sonar mapping and underwater search technology had revealed something that investigators in 2003 had missed. Beneath layers of mud and vegetation at the bottom of the canal, divers had recently discovered fragments of fabric and bone that had become trapped in the sediment near where Melissa's car was found. The remains were currently undergoing forensic analysis. Hargrove's breathing slowed noticeably as he listened. The detective continued, explaining that if the remains were confirmed to belong to Melissa Carter, investigators would be able to determine whether she had died before or after the car entered the water. Injuries, impact patterns, even microscopic evidence might reveal exactly what happened during those final moments. The implication hung clearly in the air. If Melissa had driven away alone, as Hargrove claimed, the evidence in the canal would support that version of events. But if the forensic results suggested something else, his explanation would collapse entirely. The room fell silent again. Hargrove stared at the recorder for several seconds, the small red light reflecting faintly in his eyes. For 20 years, the mystery of Melissa Carter's disappearance had remained locked inside the quiet boundaries of Clearwater Springs. Now the investigation had returned with sharper tools and far more patience than before. The detectives did not push him further at that moment. They simply told him the investigation would continue and that additional interviews might be necessary as new forensic results arrived. Then they ended the recording. As Hargrove was escorted out of the interview room, the tension that had filled the air remained behind like a lingering shadow. His story had shifted several times during the conversation, each version revealing more than the last. What began as a simple denial had turned into an admission that he had been alone with Melissa Carter shortly before she vanished. For the cold case investigators, that single fact already represented the most significant development in 20 years. Outside the building, the Florida sky had begun to darken with the approaching evening. Cars passed along the nearby highway with the same indifferent rhythm that had filled the night during the traffic stop weeks earlier. Yet the quiet movement of the investigation had changed something fundamental. A routine traffic stop had reopened a mystery that once seemed impossible to solve. And somewhere beneath the muddy water of a forgotten canal, the final pieces of the truth were beginning to surface, waiting to reveal whether the man who calmly drove away that night decades ago had been carrying a secret far darker than anyone in Clearwater Springs ever imagined. The canal outside Clearwater Springs had always been quiet, the kind of place where tall reeds leaned over dark water and the wind carried the faint scent of mud and salt from distant marshlands. For years it had existed only as a vague landmark in the investigation file, the location where Melissa Carter's car had been pulled from the water back in 2003. At the time, divers searched briefly along the canal bed but found nothing significant. The water was murky, visibility almost non-existent, and the equipment available then was limited compared to modern standards. After days of unsuccessful searching, investigators concluded that if Melissa had been in the car when it entered the canal, the current or wildlife might have carried her remains far beyond the immediate area. The canal slowly faded into the background of the case, another unanswered detail among many. Now, 2 decades later, a new search operation unfolded under very different circumstances. The state cold case unit had returned with advanced sonar equipment, underwater mapping tools, and forensic divers trained to examine even the smallest irregularities beneath layers of sediment. The area where Melissa's car had once rested was carefully scanned again, the sonar sending pulses through the dark water and returning detailed images of the canal floor that investigators in 2003 could never have imagined. The first anomaly appeared during the second day of scanning. On the monitor inside the command vehicle parked beside the canal, technicians noticed a small cluster of shapes partially buried in the mud roughly 10 feet from the location where the car had originally been recovered. At first, the shapes looked like debris, perhaps branches or fragments of discarded trash, but the pattern was irregular enough to draw attention. The team marked the coordinates and prepared for a dive. The water was thick and opaque as the divers descended slowly into the canal. Visibility was almost zero, forcing them to rely on touch and careful movements guided by the sonar readings above. After several minutes of searching along the muddy bottom, one diver felt something beneath the silt that did not resemble natural debris. He brushed the area gently with his gloved hand, revealing a fragment of fabric tangled among roots and decaying vegetation. The diver signaled for a collection bag. More careful digging followed, each movement deliberate to avoid disturbing potential evidence. Beneath layers of compacted mud, they uncovered additional fragments, small pieces of clothing, a rusted metal object that appeared to be part of a belt buckle, and eventually something far more significant. A curved structure, pale and brittle beneath the sediment.
Bone.
When the divers surfaced and the evidence bags were transferred to forensic technicians waiting on shore, the atmosphere around the canal shifted immediately. For the first time since the investigation reopened, there was a tangible possibility that Melissa Carter's remains had finally been found. The items were transported carefully to the forensic laboratory where anthropologists began the delicate process of examination. Every fragment was photographed, cataloged, and cleaned under controlled conditions. The bones were incomplete and heavily degraded after years submerged in water and sediment, but initial analysis suggested they belonged to a human adult. DNA testing would determine the identity with certainty, but even before the results returned, investigators felt the weight of what the discovery could mean. If the remains were Melissa's, then the canal had not simply been a place where her car was abandoned. It had been the final location of the crime. Meanwhile, Daniel Hargrove continued living under the quiet shadow of the investigation. After his interview with detectives, he had not been arrested. Legally, investigators needed stronger proof before filing charges, and the forensic analysis from the canal might provide that crucial evidence. Still, detectives monitored him closely, aware that suspects in long-dormant cases sometimes attempted to flee once they realized the investigation had regained momentum. Hargrove's behavior during the following weeks remained outwardly ordinary. He continued working at the warehouse outside Tampa, driving the same route each morning and evening. Yet people around him began noticing subtle changes. Co-workers later described him as distracted, quieter than usual, occasionally staring off during conversations as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. The detectives watched carefully and waited for the laboratory results. Inside the forensic facility, specialists focused on the most critical question: identity. DNA extracted from the recovered bone fragments was compared with a reference sample obtained years earlier from Melissa Carter's family. The testing required patience, as water exposure often damaged genetic material beyond easy analysis. But after several rounds of amplification and sequencing, the laboratory finally produced a conclusive match. The remains belonged to Melissa Carter. The confirmation marked a turning point that investigators in Clearwater Springs had waited more than 20 years to reach. The missing person case had now officially become a homicide investigation supported by physical evidence recovered from the canal. For Melissa's family, the news arrived with a mixture of sorrow and fragile relief. For 2 decades they had lived with uncertainty, never knowing whether she might still be alive somewhere or whether something terrible had happened the night she vanished. The discovery ended that uncertainty, but it also forced them to confront the painful reality that Melissa had died alone beneath the dark water of the canal. For detectives, the discovery raised urgent new questions about the exact circumstances of her death. Forensic anthropologists began examining the bone fragments for signs of trauma. Although the remains were incomplete, several pieces offered valuable clues. A portion of the skull displayed a fracture pattern inconsistent with simple impact from a car entering water. The break appeared to have occurred before prolonged submersion, suggesting that Melissa may have suffered a violent blow prior to the vehicle being placed in the canal. Investigators compared this finding with Daniel Hargrove's evolving account of that night. In his latest version of events, Melissa had dropped him off along the roadside before driving away alone. If that story were true, the forensic evidence from the skull fracture would require an entirely different explanation. The detectives knew the next step was inevitable. They prepared a new interview request for Hargrove, this time armed with the confirmed identification of Melissa's remains and the preliminary forensic evidence indicating trauma. Unlike the first interview, which had relied on strategic questioning and subtle pressure, the upcoming conversation would confront him directly with the reality that the investigation had moved beyond speculation. Before arranging the meeting, detectives reconstructed the entire timeline again using everything they now knew. Melissa finished her shift shortly after midnight. Surveillance captured her walking toward the parking lot. A pickup truck resembling Hargrove's passed the nearby intersection minutes earlier. Phone records showed a brief call between them that evening. Fingerprints and DNA placed him inside her car. And now the canal had yielded the final piece, the body that investigators had searched for since 2003. Each element alone might have been explained away. Together they formed a narrative that was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The detectives understood that suspects confronted with overwhelming evidence often responded in one of two ways. Some maintained their denial no matter how strong the proof became. Others, faced with the realization that the truth was closing in, began to unravel under the pressure. As preparations for the second interview moved forward, the quiet Florida town where Melissa Carter once lived began hearing whispers that the case was finally nearing resolution. News traveled quickly through the community, spreading from police sources to reporters and eventually to residents who still remembered the young waitress whose disappearance had once shaken their sense of safety. For years, Clearwater Springs had lived with a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Now the canal had given back its secret, and the man who calmly sat through the first interview, offering hesitant explanations about a forgotten car ride, was about to face the full weight of evidence that had been waiting beneath the water for more than 2 decades. The second interview was arranged quietly, without the dramatic presence of flashing cameras or uniformed officers gathering outside the building. Investigators knew that pressure often worked best when it arrived calmly, without spectacle. Daniel Hargrove received the call in the late afternoon while finishing his shift at the warehouse. Detectives asked if he would return to the station to clarify a few additional questions related to the reopened investigation. The tone of the request sounded routine, almost casual, yet beneath that calm invitation was the weight of evidence that had changed everything. Hargrove arrived just before sunset. The same narrow hallway led him to the same interview room he had sat in days earlier. Nothing about the room had changed. The metal table, the recorder, the plain walls painted in dull gray. But the atmosphere felt heavier now. The detectives waiting inside understood that the investigation had crossed a line from speculation into certainty. Melissa Carter's remains had been identified, and the forensic analysis had begun outlining the violent truth behind her disappearance. Hargrove sat down slowly, his posture more guarded than during the first meeting. His eyes moved briefly across the table, noticing the thicker stack of documents in front of the investigators. He did not ask questions immediately. Instead, he folded his hands together again, a familiar gesture from the earlier interview, though this time the calm control behind the motion seemed strained. The recorder clicked on. One of the detectives began by explaining the reason for the second meeting. They spoke directly, but without hostility. New evidence had been recovered from the canal where Melissa Carter's car was found. That evidence, they said, had confirmed something the investigation had long suspected but could never prove until now. Melissa Carter had not simply vanished. Her remains had been located in the canal. The words settled slowly into the silence of the room. Hargrove did not react immediately. His expression remained fixed, but the tension in his shoulders tightened visibly. He leaned back slightly in the chair, as if trying to create distance from the statement. The detective continued, explaining that forensic testing had confirmed the identity of the remains through DNA comparison with Melissa's family. The case that once stood as a missing person mystery had now become a confirmed homicide investigation. For several seconds, Hargrove said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. He asked where exactly the remains had been found. The detectives answered plainly. They were recovered only a short distance from where Melissa's car had been pulled from the canal in 2003. For years, the evidence had been buried beneath layers of mud and vegetation, invisible to earlier search efforts. Hargrove nodded slowly, absorbing the information, but He avoided eye contact with the investigators. Then one of the detectives slid a series of photographs across the table. They were images taken during the recent recovery operation, diverse working in dark water, evidence markers placed along the muddy shoreline, sealed bags containing fragments of clothing and bone. Hargrove looked at the photographs briefly before pushing them slightly away from himself. The detective spoke again, this time addressing the timeline that Hargrove had described during the first interview. According to his story, Melissa had dropped him off along a roadside after a brief argument and then driven away alone. If that account were true, the investigators explained, her body should not have been discovered near the car in the canal. The evidence suggested something very different had occurred. Hargrove shifted in his chair but said nothing. The second detective leaned forward slightly and introduced the next piece of information. Forensic anthropologists had examined the bone fragments recovered from the canal. Among them was a portion of Melissa's skull that showed a fracture pattern inconsistent with accidental impact. The injury appeared to have occurred before the car entered the water. The implication was clear. Melissa Carter had likely suffered a violent blow prior to the vehicle being abandoned in the canal. Hargrove exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the quiet room. The detectives continued methodically, presenting the evidence step by step. Fingerprints and DNA placed Hargrove inside the vehicle. Phone records showed he contacted Melissa shortly before she left work. Surveillance footage suggested his truck passed near the diner around the time she finished her shift. And now the forensic evidence indicated she suffered trauma before ending up in the canal. Each detail formed another link in the chain surrounding that night in 2003. Hargrove rubbed his temples briefly, his fingers pressing against the sides of his head as if the information were physically painful to hear. For a moment it looked as though he might speak, but the words did not come. The detective across the table softened his voice slightly, shifting the tone of the conversation. He explained that investigations into old cases often revealed complicated circumstances, arguments, panic, accidents that spiraled out of control. People made mistakes, he said, and sometimes those mistakes haunted them for years. The statement was not an accusation. It was an opening. Hargrove stared at the table again. Another long silence filled the room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor that had not been present before. He said he never intended to hurt Melissa. The detectives did not interrupt. Hargrove continued slowly, choosing each word carefully as if navigating a path through memories he had avoided for decades. He admitted that he had asked Melissa to meet him that night after her shift. He had been drinking earlier and wanted a ride into town because his truck had been acting unreliable that evening. She agreed to talk with him in the parking lot. When she came outside after midnight, he approached her car and got into the passenger seat. At first, the conversation was ordinary. They talked about work, about money problems, about life in the small town that both of them seemed tired of. Then the conversation turned tense. Hargrove claimed he began flirting with her, making comments she did not appreciate. Melissa told him to stop. According to his account, the situation escalated quickly into an argument as she drove away from the diner. The detectives listened without breaking the flow of his explanation. Hargrove said Melissa eventually pulled the car over along the road near the canal. She demanded that he get out immediately. The argument continued even after the car stopped. Voices were raised. Accusations were exchanged. He insisted that when she tried to push him out of the vehicle, he reacted without thinking. His hand struck her. The words hung heavily in the room. He claimed the blow was not meant to be serious, just a sudden reaction during the heated argument. But Melissa's head struck the edge of the steering wheel or the window frame. He could not remember exactly which, and she collapsed against the driver's door. Hargrove said he panicked when he realized she was not responding. He tried to shake her awake, calling her name, but she remained motionless. The quiet road around them offered no witnesses, no passing headlights, only darkness and the sound of insects in the Florida night. Fear took control. Instead of calling for help, he made a decision that would shape the next 20 years of his life. Hargrove moved Melissa's body to the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. He drove the car along the narrow road toward the canal, believing that if the vehicle disappeared in the water, investigators might assume she had crashed accidentally. When he reached the canal, he guided the car down the slope near the reeds. Then he stepped out. He pushed the vehicle forward until gravity carried it into the dark water. Hargrove's voice grew quieter as he described the moment the car sank beneath the surface. He said he stood there for several minutes, watching the ripples fade across the canal, realizing that the argument he thought would end with angry words had turned into something irreversible. Afterward, he returned to his truck and drove home. The room remained silent when he finished speaking. For the detectives, the confession confirmed what the evidence had been building toward piece by piece. The cold case that haunted Clearwater Springs for more than 2 decades had finally revealed its truth inside the same small interview room where the man responsible had once calmly denied even being inside the victim's car. And outside the station, the night air of Florida settled quietly over a town that was about to learn the mystery that lingered for 20 years had finally been solved. The confession did not arrive with shouting or dramatic gestures. It came slowly, almost quietly, as if the truth had been waiting beneath the surface of Daniel Hargrove's life for more than 20 years and finally reached the point where it could no longer remain hidden. When the words left his mouth inside the interview room, the detectives did not interrupt. They allowed him to continue describing the events of that night in 2003, each sentence pulling another piece of the long-buried story into the light. Hargrove sat forward in the chair now, his earlier composure gone. His hands moved restlessly across the table as he spoke, tracing small circles on the metal surface while he tried to recall details that had haunted his memory for decades. He said that after striking Melissa during the argument, the silence inside the car terrified him more than the fight itself. At first, he believed she had simply lost consciousness, that she might wake up after a few minutes. He shook her shoulders repeatedly, calling her name, hoping she would respond. But the only sound inside the vehicle was his own breathing and the distant hum of insects outside. The detectives listened closely, recording every word. Hargrove explained that the realization began creeping into his mind slowly. Melissa's body remained completely still. Her head leaned awkwardly toward the door, and when he touched her wrist, he could not feel the steady pulse he expected. Panic overwhelmed him. He described his thoughts racing in every direction at once. He imagined police arriving, imagined being blamed for something he claimed he never intended to happen. In that moment, fear replaced judgment. Instead of seeking help, he focused on hiding what had happened. He moved Melissa into the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. The road near the canal was familiar to him, a place he had driven many times while working construction jobs in the area. It was dark and rarely traveled at night. As he drove, he convinced himself that if the car disappeared in the water, investigators might believe Melissa lost control of the vehicle and crashed accidentally. When he reached the edge of the canal, the water reflected faint moonlight between the reeds. He stopped the car and sat there for several seconds, unsure of what to do next. According to his account, part of him considered driving away and abandoning the vehicle somewhere else, but the fear of being seen kept pushing him toward the same desperate decision. He stepped out of the driver's door and walked around to the front of the car. The ground near the canal sloped gently downward, muddy and uneven beneath his boots. He placed both hands on the hood and pushed. At first, the vehicle resisted, its tires gripping the damp soil. Then slowly, the weight shifted. The car rolled forward a few inches, then more. Hargrove said he stepped back as the vehicle slid further down the embankment. Within seconds, the front end dipped into the canal, water rushing over the bumper. The momentum carried it deeper until the entire car sank beneath the dark surface. He stood there watching the ripples spread across the water, realizing the moment had sealed the fate of the story he would carry for the rest of his life. When he returned to his truck and drove home that night, he believed the plan might work. Melissa's disappearance would look like a tragic accident. A tired driver leaving work late at night, a narrow road beside a canal, a car slipping into the water. It seemed believable in his panicked mind. But the plan unraveled almost immediately. The following day, news spread quickly through Clearwater Springs that Melissa Carter was missing. Her family reported her disappearance when she failed to answer calls and did not show up for work. Volunteers began searching the surrounding roads and fields. Hargrove watched the unfolding story with growing dread, realizing that if the car was discovered before enough time passed, investigators might question how it ended up in the canal. Days later, when Melissa's vehicle was finally found partially submerged in the water, the fear returned with full force. He remembered watching the news coverage as police pulled the car from the canal and searched the surrounding area. Each report made his chest tighten with the possibility that divers might discover the truth buried beneath the muddy water. But the divers found nothing. Hargrove described the moment as the point when his fear slowly transformed into something else, relief mixed with a heavy silence that followed him through the years. Without a body and without witnesses, the investigation gradually lost direction. The town speculated about strangers, about kidnappers passing through, about every possibility except the one he carried in his memory. Within weeks, he left Clearwater Springs, telling coworkers he had found work elsewhere. He moved across Florida, taking jobs wherever he could and avoiding the small town where the secret had been created. For a long time, he convinced himself the past had been sealed permanently beneath the water of the canal. But he admitted that the memory never disappeared completely. Every time he heard about a cold case being reopened on the news, he wondered if investigators would eventually return to Clearwater Springs and re-examine the evidence. When technology improved and stories emerged about old crimes being solved through DNA and forensic advancements, the quiet fear resurfaced again. Still, years passed without any sign that the investigation had moved forward. The detective sitting across from him understood that many long-hidden crimes followed this pattern. The person responsible slowly convinced themselves that time had erased the danger, that the truth had been buried so deeply it would never rise again. Until something unexpected happened. For Hargrove, that moment arrived on the side of a highway during what should have been an ordinary traffic stop. He described the memory clearly during the interview. When the patrol officer returned to his cruiser with the license and began running his information through the system, Hargrove felt an uncomfortable sense of recognition he could not explain. The moment seemed routine on the surface, yet the flashing blue lights triggered an old instinctive fear he had not felt in years. When the officer casually asked about Clearwater Springs and Melissa Carter, the past returned all at once. Hargrove said he realized in that instant that the investigation might not be as forgotten as he believed. Even though the officer let him leave with a warning, the encounter unsettled him deeply. For the first time in decades, he began wondering whether the evidence inside Melissa's car might still exist somewhere in a police archive. What he did not know was that the fingerprints and DNA preserved on that passenger door handle had been waiting quietly in an evidence locker the entire time. As Hargrove finished describing the events of that night in 2003, the detectives in the interview room remained silent for several seconds. The confession filled the space with a heavy finality that could not be undone. One of the investigators eventually spoke again, confirming that the statement Hargrove had given would be documented and submitted as part of the homicide investigation. Formal charges would follow, and the case would proceed through the legal process. Hargrove nodded slowly, as if he had expected those words long before he walked into the room. Outside the station building, night had settled fully across the Florida sky. Cars moved quietly along the distant highway, unaware that a mystery that once haunted a small town for more than 2 decades had finally reached its conclusion. For the residents of Clearwater Springs, the story of Melissa Carter had become something almost legendary over the years, a disappearance whispered about in grocery stores and remembered during quiet conversations about the past. Now the truth behind that mystery was no longer hidden in speculation or rumor. It had been revealed piece by piece, starting with a simple traffic stop that exposed the one man who knew exactly what happened on that silent road beside the canal in 2003. The confession traveled quickly through the channels of law enforcement before it ever reached the public. Inside the sheriff's department in Clearwater Springs, detectives who had once worked the original investigation received the news with a mixture of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. For years, the case file had sat in evidence storage, a thick binder filled with interviews, photographs, and unanswered questions. Some of the officers who first searched for Melissa Carter in 2003 had long since retired, while others had transferred to different departments across Florida. Yet when word spread that the mystery had finally been solved, the story seemed to reconnect everyone who had once been involved. Daniel Hargrove was formally placed under arrest soon after his second interview concluded. The process unfolded calmly, without drama. He did not resist when detectives informed him that he was being charged in connection with the death of Melissa Carter. As officers guided him through the hallway toward the processing area, his expression remained distant, almost detached, as if the events unfolding around him were part of someone else's life. News of the arrest reached Clearwater Springs within hours. Local reporters who had occasionally revisited the case over the years began broadcasting updates across television stations and online platforms. Headlines spread quickly through the community. The 2003 disappearance that had once left an entire town searching for answers was no longer a mystery. For many residents, the news reopened memories that had never completely faded. People who once stood in candlelight vigils remembered the fear that followed Melissa's disappearance. Parents recalled warning their children to stay close after dark. The quiet diner where Melissa worked had closed years earlier, but longtime locals could still picture the place clearly. The late-night glow of the windows, the sound of coffee cups clinking against ceramic plates, the friendly waitress who greeted customers by name. Melissa Carter had been 27 years old when she vanished, an ordinary young woman whose life was defined by work, family, and small-town routines. Her disappearance shattered that sense of ordinary safety, leaving behind a question that lingered across 2 decades. Now that question finally had an answer. As details of Hargrove's confession became public, the story unfolded again in the media, this time with a clarity that had never existed before. Investigators described how advances in forensic technology allowed them to re-examine evidence that once seemed useless. Fingerprints recovered from the passenger door of Melissa's car, partial DNA traces preserved on the handle, and the remains discovered beneath the canal's muddy bottom all combined to reveal the truth that had remained hidden since 2003. For Melissa's family, the resolution carried complicated emotions. The confirmation of her death was painful, yet it also ended years of uncertainty that had weighed heavily on them. Her sister, who had organized countless vigils and searches in the early years, described the moment she received the call from detectives. She said the news felt like the closing of a long, painful chapter, even though it could never erase the loss. Investigators also revisited the canal, where the final pieces of the case were discovered. The quiet stretch of water that once held only unanswered questions now stood as the location where the truth finally surfaced. Forensic teams returned several times to document the site carefully, ensuring that every detail of the recovery operation would support the legal case moving forward. Daniel Hargrove remained in custody while prosecutors prepared the charges. During additional interviews with detectives, he repeated the story he had given in the second interrogation. According to his account, the argument inside the car had escalated suddenly, and the fatal blow had not been planned. But prosecutors pointed out that his actions after the incident, moving Melissa's body, driving to the canal, and pushing the vehicle into the water, demonstrated a deliberate effort to conceal what had happened. Legal experts explained that even without intent to kill, those decisions carried serious consequences under the law. The act of hiding the crime and leaving Melissa's body submerged in the canal for 2 decades transformed the case into a deliberate cover-up that prosecutors were prepared to pursue aggressively. As the legal process moved forward, investigators continued reconstructing the final timeline of that night in 2003 with as much precision as possible. Phone records, witness statements, and Hargrove's own confession combined to paint a clearer picture than anyone had ever seen before. Melissa finished her shift shortly after midnight and walked into the humid Florida night, unaware that the man waiting nearby would become the last person to see her alive. The argument that followed inside the car lasted only minutes, but the consequences stretched across more than 20 years. For the detectives who reopened the case, the investigation served as a powerful reminder of how even the smallest piece of evidence could survive long enough to change everything. The fingerprint left on a door handle, the DNA preserved inside a sealed evidence bag, the fragments of bone buried beneath canal sediment. All of it waited quietly until technology and persistence finally brought it together. In Clearwater Springs, the story gradually shifted from shock to reflection. Residents who once feared the unknown began discussing the case again, this time with the clarity of understanding what truly happened. The mystery that once haunted the town was no longer defined by speculation but by a confirmed narrative of violence, panic, and concealment. The diner where Melissa once worked no longer existed, but the memory of her presence remained vivid among those who knew her. Former coworkers described her as someone who brightened late-night shifts with conversation and laughter. Regular customers remembered the way she greeted them by name even when the restaurant was busy. Those memories carried a bittersweet weight now that the truth had emerged. The canal itself returned to silence after the forensic teams completed their work. Reeds swayed gently along the muddy banks, and the dark water reflected the quiet Florida sky just as it had for decades. To a passerby, it would look like any other rural waterway, offering no visible sign of the secret it held for so many years. But the story tied to that place had finally reached its conclusion. For law enforcement, the case stood as another example of how cold investigations sometimes wait patiently for the right moment. Evidence preserved long ago may appear meaningless at the time, yet decades later it can become the key that unlocks a mystery thought impossible to solve. And in this case, the turning point came from something as simple and unexpected as a routine traffic stop on a dark Florida highway. A patrol officer pulling over a drifting vehicle could never have known that the name on the driver's license would lead investigators back to a disappearance that once shook an entire community. Yet that single moment reopened the path to a truth buried beneath water, mud, and time. The mystery of Melissa Carter's disappearance had endured for 20 years. Now, at last, the silence surrounding her story had finally been broken. The courtroom in Pinellas County was unusually quiet on the morning the case finally reached its most decisive stage. 2 decades had passed since the night Melissa Carter vanished from Clearwater Springs, yet the weight of that unanswered mystery still lingered in the air as people filed into the wooden benches. Reporters arranged their notebooks and cameras. Longtime residents sat shoulder to shoulder, and at the front of the room the Carter family waited in silence. The passage of 20 years had changed many things, but the memory of Melissa had never disappeared from this community. Daniel Hargrove entered the courtroom slowly under the supervision of deputies, his hands cuffed in front of him. The man who once blended into ordinary life now carried the attention of an entire region that had spent years wondering what happened to a young waitress who simply vanished after finishing her shift. As he took his seat beside his attorney, the contrast between the present moment and the distant summer night of 2003 felt almost unreal. For 2 decades, the case had existed as a cold case file buried in evidence storage. Now it was the center of a courtroom proceeding that would finally determine responsibility for what happened. Prosecutors began presenting the story piece by piece, reconstructing the chain of events that started with Melissa leaving the diner shortly after midnight. They described the humid Florida air, the quiet parking lot, and the moment she walked toward her car without realizing that someone she trusted was waiting nearby. Witnesses who had seen her earlier that evening testified about the ordinary details of her final hours. A coworker described Melissa laughing with customers during the late shift, unaware that the night would end in violence. Another witness recalled seeing her vehicle leaving the diner parking lot shortly after closing time. From there, the narrative shifted toward the investigation that followed her disappearance. Detectives explained how the community reacted in the early days of the search, how volunteers combed through nearby fields and wooded areas, and how every possible lead was pursued. The jury listened as investigators described the frustration of an inquiry that seemed to stall despite months of work. Melissa's abandoned car had never been found at the time, and without physical evidence, the trail slowly faded. What remained was only a collection of witness statements, unanswered questions, and a town that refused to forget her. Then prosecutors turned to the breakthrough that reopened the case years later. They described how modern forensic techniques allowed evidence to be re-examined with greater precision than investigators ever had in 2003. Fingerprints preserved in the original case file were compared again against updated databases. DNA traces recovered from inside the car door handle were tested using methods that had not existed when the case first began. Those results pointed directly toward Daniel Hargrove, a name that had never appeared prominently in the early investigation. The courtroom grew quieter as detectives testified about the moment Hargrove's name surfaced again during the routine traffic stop that triggered the reopening of the case. The officer who made that stop described how the encounter began with nothing more than a minor traffic violation on a dark Florida road. At the time, it seemed like an ordinary shift patrol moment. Yet the identification check connected Hargrove to old records that investigators later reviewed more carefully, eventually linking him to Melissa's disappearance. From that point forward, the evidence unfolded steadily. Forensic specialists explained how the submerged car was located in the canal after investigators followed new information uncovered during the renewed inquiry. Photographs of the recovery operation were shown to the jury, revealing the vehicle that had rested beneath murky water for more than 20 years. Experts described the painstaking process of examining the car after it was lifted from the canal, documenting every fingerprint, every trace of biological material, and every detail that could reconstruct the events of that night. The testimony then shifted to the remains recovered from the same canal. Forensic anthropologists explained how they identified the bones as belonging to Melissa Carter through dental records and DNA comparisons with her surviving relatives. Although time and water had erased many details, the evidence confirmed what her family had feared for years. The woman who disappeared in 2003 had never left Clearwater Springs alive. The most powerful moment in the trial arrived when detectives described Daniel Hargrove's own words during interrogation. Investigators recounted how he initially denied any involvement, maintaining that he barely knew Melissa. But as evidence accumulated and inconsistencies appeared in his statements, the conversation gradually shifted. During a later interview, confronted with forensic results and the recovered vehicle, Hargrove finally admitted that he had been with Melissa that night. According to the account he provided, the argument inside the car escalated quickly. He claimed the confrontation turned physical in a moment of anger that he never intended to become fatal. Prosecutors did not dispute that the exact sequence of events might never be known in perfect detail, but they emphasized the decisions that followed. Instead of calling for help or reporting what happened, Hargrove chose to hide the truth. He drove the car to the canal, pushed the vehicle into the water with Melissa still inside, and walked away from the scene, leaving the evidence buried beneath the surface. The jury listened carefully as prosecutors argued that those actions transformed the crime into something far more deliberate than a momentary loss of control. Concealing the body, abandoning the car, and allowing Melissa's family to search for her for 20 years demonstrated a conscious effort to escape responsibility. Throughout the proceedings, members of the Carter family remained composed, though the emotional weight of the testimony was impossible to ignore. Melissa's sister sat quietly beside her parents, occasionally closing her eyes as witnesses described the night their loved one disappeared. For them, the trial was not only about legal accountability, but also about hearing the truth spoken aloud after decades of silence. Defense attorneys attempted to portray the incident as an accidental tragedy rather than a planned act of violence. They argued that panic and fear drove Hargrove's decisions after the confrontation. However, prosecutors responded by highlighting the years that followed. During those 2 decades, Hargrove lived an ordinary life, moving between jobs and neighborhoods, while Melissa's family endured endless uncertainty. The closing arguments brought the entire story together. Prosecutors reminded the jury that this case was once considered unsolvable. A young woman vanished without a trace, her car disappeared, and the investigation slowly faded into a cold case file. Yet evidence never truly disappears when it is carefully preserved. Advances in forensic science, combined with persistence from investigators, allowed the truth to surface years later. They described the chain of events that ultimately exposed the hidden crime. A routine traffic stop triggered a review of old records. New forensic technology revealed fingerprints and DNA that once remained undetected. A submerged vehicle was recovered from a canal where it had rested unseen for decades. Each piece connected to the next until the mystery that haunted Clearwater Springs finally reached a conclusion. When the jury left the courtroom to deliberate, The tension was palpable. Reporters waited outside the building while residents gathered quietly in the hallway. For many people in the town, the verdict would represent the final chapter in a story that began with a missing poster taped to a diner window 20 years earlier. Hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood and read the decision. Daniel Hargrove was found guilty for his role in the death of Melissa Carter and the concealment of the crime that followed. The verdict brought a wave of emotion across the room. Melissa's family held each other tightly while the judge confirmed the decision and scheduled sentencing. Outside the courthouse, the news spread quickly through Clearwater Springs. For the first time since 2003, residents spoke about the case not as an unsolved disappearance, but as a resolved chapter of their town's history. The mystery that once defined the story had finally been replaced with truth. Years earlier, the canal had quietly hidden the evidence beneath its dark surface. Now the truth that lay buried there had emerged into the open. What began as a routine traffic stop on a quiet Florida road ultimately revealed a secret that endured for 2 decades. And for the family who waited all those years, the long shadow of uncertainty had finally come to an end. Long after the verdict was delivered and the courtroom emptied, the story of Melissa Carter continued to echo quietly through Clearwater Springs, a town that had carried the weight of her disappearance for more than 20 years. The headlines that once screamed across television screens and online news sites slowly faded, replaced by the slower rhythm of everyday life. Yet the memory of the case lingered in conversations at grocery stores, in quiet discussions between neighbors, and in the quiet reflections of people who had lived through the long years when the truth remained hidden. For the Carter family, closure did not arrive as a sudden moment of relief, but as a gradual shift in the emotional landscape of their lives. For 2 decades, their memories had been dominated by uncertainty, the endless cycle of questions that followed every cold case, the quiet hope that one day someone might come forward with information. Now that the truth had been spoken in a courtroom and confirmed by a jury, that uncertainty was finally gone, replaced by a difficult but undeniable understanding of what happened on that humid Florida night in 2003. Melissa Carter's story began as something tragically ordinary, a young woman finishing her late shift at a small diner, walking into the warm darkness of a summer night with plans for the next day, unaware that those plans would never unfold. Her disappearance shocked Clearwater Springs not only because of the suddenness of it, but because the town believed it knew its own streets, its own people, and the quiet patterns of life that defined the community. When Melissa vanished, that sense of safety fractured. Parents began watching their children more closely, neighbors locked doors that had once remained open, and every unfamiliar car that passed slowly through town attracted suspicious glances. The mystery of her disappearance was never just about one missing person. It was about the unsettling realization that danger had slipped quietly into a place that believed itself protected by familiarity. As the years passed, the case evolved into something else entirely. It became one of those lingering mysteries that communities carry like an invisible scar. The original search efforts faded, the posters slowly disappeared from windows and telephone poles, and the detectives who worked the case moved on to other investigations. Yet the question remained. What happened to Melissa Carter? Where did she go? Who was responsible? The absence of answers created its own kind of haunting presence, a silence that stretched across years and generations. Younger residents who grew up in Clearwater Springs heard the story the way people hear local legends. They knew the name Melissa Carter even if they had never met her. They knew about the diner where she worked, about the night she vanished, and about the search that followed. For them, the case represented a mystery frozen in time,